When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Aegon's Conquest. We're going to talk about how he was actually able to conquer most of the kingdoms. He did not conquer all of them. As well as how it all happened. You know, what went on, the major battles, the major kind of political talks that went on during this time period, and all that. So if you guys are excited for today's video, like, subscribe, and comment for more of this type of content. And let's get into it. So, getting into Aegon's Conquest, the first thing we really have to talk about is how did the Targaryens actually end up getting to Westeros? Now, the Targaryens were part of Old Valyria and all that stuff, and Lord Aenar Targaryen had moved the family to Dragonstone about 12 years before the Doom. They had gotten a vision that more or less the Doom was going to happen, and so Aenar Targaryen decided to move the family and all of that. Now, Aegon actually was not with his family at this point. Aegon had been off in the east, helping the free cities against the Volantis, people, and against their fleets, and eventually he is able to help them kind of defeat the Volantis fleet, and he actually turns his attention west. He starts to go towards Westeros. So, for a while, really, the Targaryens just lived on Dragonstone. They weren't really invading or anything. It's not kind of how we see sometimes where people suggest that, Aegon just, boom, the Targaryens got there and they just started invading. It's not really what happened. Also, we see some other preparation for this conquest when the painted table was made. It was actually, made years before the actual conquest. If you don't know the table I'm referencing, it is kind of the table we always saw in the show where it has the entire layout of Westeros on it. It's a really cool table, something I'd actually love to have in my personal life. I don't know if anybody makes that, but that'd be awesome. But yeah, that is kind of another thing that I want to talk about pre-conquest. Aegon, at this point, starts by declaring himself king, right? He comes back to Westeros. He basically says, I am the king. I'm going to try and unite all of Westeros into one kingdom. Because at this time, you really had 7 kingdoms, right? You had our normal, all the normal 7 kingdoms. You had the Iron Islands, which was attached to Harren, and he was kind of in charge of the Riverlands as well. So that was kind of what you had going on at this time period, and Aegon was looking to more or less combine them all under Aegon's rule. Now, the thing is that's actually interesting is that a lot of houses actually did try to make alliances with Aegon, but the thing that is very interesting about Aegon, and it's something that's very interesting about Stannis as well, I think they have some similarities when it comes to that point, is that if they did not bend the knee to Stannis, or Aegon in this case, then he wouldn't accept the alliance. Like, there was an alliance that was proposed by, by House Durrandon, who they had been, right now, at this point, the Lords of Storm's End and the Stormlands. They had said, hey, Aegon, we'll help you if, you help us against, Harren. And he declines this because they would not bend the knee. And that was the key thing for Aegon. So yeah, that was kind of Aegon's mindset going in, that he was not going to make alliances unless you bowed to him. If you gave him fealty, then yeah, we could have an alliance and we could do all this stuff. But early on in the war, Aegon really did not make a lot of alliances at all. Now, when the war does begin in about 2 BC, Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya decide to land at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush next to 3 hills. At this point, they had about 1,600 men, and where they land ends up kind of being the place of King's Landing, but for this point, it is just going to be Aegon's fort early on in the war. That is what it was known as, but yeah, that is where kind of everything starts. Now, right off the bat, a couple minor houses like House Rosby and House Stokeworth do surrender and pledge fealty to Aegon. They yield to Rhaenys and then Visenya as well. And then when Aegon lands, his kind of focus was on the combined forces of Duskendale and Maidenpool. Orys Baratheon led the army. He was kind of the main figurehead during Aegon's conquest for the land part of the invasion. Aegon was always kind of in the sky with the dragons, as well as Visenya and Rhaenys, but Orys was kind of the person, kind of like your field general, more or less. Now, what I think is very interesting is in this first battle, we already see how important the dragons were. Aegon in this first battle was actually outnumbered quite a bit, almost 2-1. But because of Aegon having the dragon, he was able to descend on this army from the sky. And this was the first time really in Westeros that the dragons had been seen and or used to its like full extent. And because of this, both leaders were killed and then inevitably surrender and pledge fealty to Aegon. Now, after this, Visenya does finally crown Aegon. He's given this kind of Valyrian steel type crown with like rubies on it. It's really cool. And that is kind of where I believe Aegon, kind of his reign begins almost, because he is finally crowned. I know there is a point later on where he's officially crowned at Old Town, but I believe this is really where I would say that his kind of reign begins after his first couple of victories in Westeros. Now, something that doesn't get talked about too much is that Aegon actually had a major defeat in the war, and it comes very early on. He had sent Daemon Velaryon with Visenya and most of the kind of navy of Aegon to take Goldtown. Now, this is a very interesting point again, because when we think about Aegon's conquest, we kind of think of how he kind of steamroll through the kingdoms, when in reality, this is the only time really he's ever kind of defeated, right? And even the defeat is a very kind of defeat, right? But Aegon ends up losing his entire fleet, his naval commander in Daemon Velaryon. But on the flip side of it, right, Visenya Targaryen is actually able to burn all of Goldtown's fleet as well. So, you know, it's not really a win for either side, in my opinion. I guess if you would say it was more of a win for Goldtown. But again, that is really one of the major... That is really the only defeat Aegon really ever suffers in Aegon's conquest outside of Dorne. Now, while Visenya had been doing this, Aegon decides to march on Harrenhal. Now, this is significant because it's the first real kingdom that Aegon's going up against, and Harren was pretty ready for this, right? He attacks them twice before they even get to Harrenhal, and, you know, Aegon does win them, but he takes heavy losses in both. So early on, we're already seeing Aegon start to take heavy losses, and the war, in my opinion, is actually not going that well for Aegon. But this is kind of where it all changes, right? Harren had never been a great lord. He wasn't someone that was very well liked. And we see this very instantly when the River Lords actually flip sides on him. Led by Edmund Tully, the River Lords kind of go to Aegon's side and try to help against Harren. Now, Harren, realizing that he's now outnumbered with all of these River Lords flipping on him, decides to stay in Harrenhal. Very smart choice. You know, he's outnumbered, and Harrenhal at this point was known as the probably most impregnable castle in all of Westeros. It was the tallest, had the thickest walls. It was really everything you would want in a city, or a castle, I guess. And Aegon kind of gives Harren a chance for peace, right? He's like, if you surrender, give me fealty, I will give you the Iron Islands and all that stuff, and, you know, you won't die, right? And Harren, kind of not realizing how much the dragons would impact this war, kind of goes, what are you going to do, right? All those men can march on this castle and they will die. And this, you know, fortress is not made of wood. So what is your dragon going to do? Burn down stone and stuff like that? And Harren rejects these terms by Aegon, and Aegon goes back, and the next day, Harren and all of his sons and all of his descendants are burnt alive within the castle. And that is kind of where the ghosts of Harren come from. But Harrenhal is defeated. Now, what I think is very interesting is that we see Edmund Tully is instantly made the Lord Paramount of the Trident. So this is how the Tullys come into power and all of that. Now, we also see that the swords that Harren had, they were all melted down and were used for the Iron Throne. These are the first swords that were actually used in that, so we also have that little tidbit of knowledge. All of those swords do end up getting sent back to the Aegon's fort for now. Now, after this event occurs, Orys Baratheon, as well as Rhaenys, lead the majority of the army south to the Stormlands. Now, at this point, the Stormlands are being ruled by House Durrandon, or specifically Argilac Durrandon was in charge. Now, again, we see that these kingdoms were not defenseless, right? They actually had an ambush for Orys Baratheon, And this ambush actually kills 1,000 of the men led by Orys and Rhaenys. And again, it's this thing where people are really, they're not that dumb. It's just the fact that all these people don't have dragons, and dragons were so influential in this war, as we'll continue to see going on in Aegon's Conquest. Because after this ambush occurs and they're all kind of retreating out of the ambush and, you know, all that, Rhaenys basically burns the forest down in which that they are retreating, and a ton of men are killed and or wounded. Now, Argilac, seeing what had already happened with Harren and how he had stayed in Harrenhal, Argilac looked to meet Orys Baratheon and Rhaenys on the battlefield. So he marches all of his men out and all that. But Rhaenys, knowing this, she'd already, you know, seen it or whatever, tells Orys Baratheon this, and they kind of look to fortify position on a hill south at Bronzegate, and they really pretty much just wait there. They wait until Argilac comes. Argilac finally makes it to this kind of meeting place, and Argilac actually almost defeats Orys Baratheon. They start to kind of break the lines of Orys, and really the battle only changes when, again, Rhaenys and her dragon comes in and breaks the line a bit, destroys the guard of Argilac Durrandon, and then actually makes him fall off his saddle, unmounts him or whatever. And Orys Baratheon gives him the option to surrender and all that, and Argilac just does not want to do this. They have a kind of a one-on-one combat, and Orys Baratheon ends up killing Argilac Durrandon. Now, after the battle, we see that the fortress is still not kind of being given up. Storm's End is actually still like holding out against them, and this is because Argilac's daughter had not wanted to kind of give up the power of being queen of the Stormlands and all that. And eventually, you know, some of the men inside the castle realize the hopelessness of the situation and that they're all going to die if she does this. They kind of like smuggle her out of the castle, basically. And interestingly enough, Orys Baratheon ends up actually marrying her. So through marriage, more or less, and Aegon ends up giving Orys Baratheon kind of Storm's End and makes him paramount of the Stormlands. So that ends up happening, and that is kind of how the Baratheons come into power. The Baratheons also take the sigil and the words of House Durrandon, so that also happens. And around the same time, Aegon decides to send Visenya to Crackclaw Point, which they basically instantly surrender, and they get fealty to Aegon, just based upon the fact that they weren't a major house at this point, and also, I mean, Visenya had a dragon there, so they instantly decide to surrender. Next up, we have the Lannisters and the Gardeners. Now, these were two kings at this point. The Gardeners were of the Reach, and the Lannisters of the Westerlands. They decide to actually team up, right? They see that this is actually way more of a major threat, looking at how House Durrandon and the Harren of Harrenhal had fallen. We see them team up. Now, what's really interesting is at this point, this was the largest army that had ever been seen on Westeros with these two kings. There was 55,000 men in the Lannister Gardener army, and they had been, again, following suit with the Durrandons. They decided, we're not going to sit in our castle. We're going to march out and kind of force a fight with Aegon. Now, they started to march toward the southern plains near the Blackwater Rush. Now, Aegon heard of this gathered army, and the problem is he only really had a fifth of the size. But regardless of that, he moved to meet them, but he did wait a bit at Stony Sept to where Aegon can meet up with both of his sisters, and two, kind of come up with a plan. And yeah, as we know, Rhaenys had been in the Stormlands, and Visenya had been at Crackclaw Point. They finally are all three together. Now, this is the first time we see them all three together for any type of battle, and it really shows, resulting in the next battle with the Lannisters and the Gardeners, resulting in the famous nickname, the Field of Fire. This results in 5,000 dead Lannisters and Gardeners, as well as tens of thousands of men wounded. And this is actually the end of House Garner. This battle ends up destroying their house. There's none really left. And on the other side of that, Lauren Lannister, he also does end up escaping the battle, but only a day later, all the Westerland lords decide to bend the knee and swear fealty to Aegon. Aegon, realizing that he has to really capture the Reach because they did not, because House Gardener is gone, They go to Highgarden to try and seize it and find that it's already yielded, no conflict was needed, and that Harlan Tyrell, the steward of the castle, decides to surrender it instantly. Now, Aegon rewards him by making him the Warden of the South, as well as giving him Highgarden. Something I also want to note with Loren Lannister is that he is also made a Warden of the West. Now, with this being said, Torrhen Stark does end up marching from the north with 30,000 men and starts to kind of go past the neck. Now, Torrhen Stark was kind of faced with an interesting decision because some of his lords were saying, we should probably surrender after the Field of Fire. And some of them were like, we should fight on. We're Northmen. We're worth more than like all these other kingdoms and stuff like that. And Torrhen Stark, I keep saying his name wrong, in my opinion, makes the smart decision, right? He goes, okay, we're going to surrender. We can't win this war without dragons and all that stuff. And he ends up, taking a knee and giving fealty to Aegon, and was named Warden of the North. Now, the real last kingdom that decides to still oppose Aegon is the Vale. Now, what I also think is interesting about the Vale, and we can see very much similarities between the normal story in A Song of Ice and Fire and Aegon's Conquest, is that Shara Aaron, I don't know why I almost said Ain, but Shara Aaron basically refuses to bend the knee for Aegon, and she had just stayed out of the war for the most part, which is something very similar to what Lysa Arryn does, and I know there's other motivations going on there with Littlefinger and all that, but it's still very similar that the Arryns stay out of a major conflict like, this as well. So Shara Aaron basically believes that no one can get to the Eyrie, more or less, so we'll just sit in our walls, just, make sure our defenses are really good at the Bloody Gate and all that, and we'll be fine. And one day, Visenya decides to fly directly into the Eyrie's inner courtyard. Now, Shara Aaron sees this. She comes down and finds that her son, Ronald Aaron, was just sitting on one of Visenya's knee. And Ronald had been kind of going, I want to ride, the dragon and stuff like that. And he actually ends up doing this, right? Him and Visenya kind of go around the castle about 3 times and then come back down. And when they come back down, Ronald is made Warden of the East and kind of the Lord of the Vale and all that stuff. And it's very interesting to me on how this is done, right? Because Shara Aaron definitely can see this as a threat. It's like, okay, we can just come in here anytime we want. So even if I leave and you try to, oppose us, I can do this again. And a really good play by Visenya, and it shows how smart she really was in that whole situation. But yeah, so Ronald then made Warden of the East and all that. So you now have all your wardens established. Really the last thing that ends up happening that is directly in Aegon's Conquest is we see Aegon kind of going to Old Town, and the High Towers kind of realizing how hopeless the situation is. They just surrender, and the gates are pretty much wide open. Now, this is really where Aegon is actually crowned as the normal king of Westeros and all that stuff. And this is where in the history books, really, the reign of Aegon starts, but I would like to say it is actually the first time he is crowned by Visenya. But all that happens, and really the lasting things you have is that the Iron Islands end up getting taken over by the Greyjoys and ruled by the Greyjoys, alongside the help of Aegon, because there was kind of a civil war going on there, so Aegon ends up going there and fixing all that. And then the last thing that we kind of end off with on Aegon's Conquest that doesn't end up going well is kind of the First Dornish War, where this ends up happening, but there's also something that's interesting is when Rhaenys ends up going to Dorne kind of near the end of Aegon's Conquest, where she kind of goes there and finds everything empty. All these towns and cities only have old women or women and children, and she ends up finding, the Lady Martell, or the Queen of the Dornish at this point, and she basically is like, we're not going to surrender. Right, and it doesn't matter what you do, you can come in here with fire and blood, we will not, bow. And they do the whole, her family quote, unbound, unbent, unbroken. They do all that, and it's a really cool scene within Fire and Blood in the books and stuff like that. But yeah, Aegon does eventually decide to try and conquer Dorne, and it does not go well. So that is kind of the end of this video. King's Landing as well does get established, and we'll say that before we end out the video. King's Landing ends up being established on the hills that we talked about earlier in the video, and the throne gets made and all that stuff. But yeah, if you guys would like for me to talk about the First Dornish War and Aegon's kind of no success really in Dorne, let me know. But thank you guys all for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.